In the early morning hours of August 11th, 1965, the sound of the road underneath a bus traveling along Turkey's D100 highway had lulled many of the 40 passengers aboard to sleep. During the previous evening, the bus departed to Ankara for a 350-kilometer westbound trip to Istanbul, which is the country's capital city. As the passengers rested just after 3 a.m., the driver, Özdemir, guided the bus into the Hendek district of one of the provinces, which is an area that's home to more than 1 million people today, located along the coast of the Black Sea. As they approached a village around 3:15 a.m., the highway was pitch black when Özdemir finally saw what was ahead of him. Parked in the road, just coming into the view of the headlights, was a tanker truck that had become disabled by a mechanical issue, but by the time he saw it, it was already too late. Özdemir then slammed on the brakes, hoping to stop the bus before it slammed into the tanker, but a collision was inevitable. The only question was how bad it would be. Fortunately, the brakes did their part in slowing the speeding bus down to the point where the impact wasn't even enough to wake all the sleeping passengers. Damage to the bus was also fortunately minimal, and none of those aboard were even injured. It appeared at first glance that a complete disaster was averted, but the parked truck didn't fare nearly as well. The impact of the accident was enough to cause the truck's tanker to spill its hull all over the highway, and this was a significant problem no one on the bus could have imagined. This is because the truck was carrying a full tank of nitric acid, which is a colorless liquid most often used in the production of fertilizers and explosives. Nitric acid is highly toxic and corrosive and can come in varying concentrations, but most often, the commercially available solution is about 32% water. The nitric acid inside the truck's tanker, however, was less than 10% water, putting the load in a category of chemicals that causes fuming. These fumes can cause respiratory problems if inhaled, which can be severe enough to cause pulmonary edema, which is where fluid fills the lungs. That, however, is next to nothing compared to what happens if nitric acid comes in contact with your skin. It's a highly corrosive chemical that will cause severe, agonizing burns, and it was all over the highway. Running along the road was a ditch that contained water, and as the nitric acid spilled out over the asphalt, it ran down into the ditch and mixed with the water. In almost an instant, this filled the air with a thick white smoke that quickly infiltrated the bus. The noxious fumes were then more than enough to awaken the passengers, and the first thing they saw when they opened their eyes was this smoke. Chaos inside then immediately broke out as passengers believed the bus was on fire. This then caused a stampede toward the front door of the bus as people desperately tried to escape. Thankfully, though, while it was a completely chaotic exit, everyone aboard managed to get out of the bus, but this only brought about their next, more horrifying ordeal. As the passengers collected along the roadside, away from the growing smoke, they all began to feel the searing pain of nitric acid that had splashed onto their skin when they stepped off the bus. Panic then ensued as this became more and more intense. One of the passengers then spotted a small pit of liquid in the roadside ditch and sought the relief of washing whatever was off his skin, and because nitric acid. It looks exactly like water. No one could have known that the fluid in the ditch wasn't just harmless rain runoff from the highway. Instead, it had become mostly a vat of acid from the tanker. The passenger then desperately leapt into the ditch, completely submerging himself in the spilled liquid, and seeing this, others followed behind him. Within seconds, everyone who jumped into the ditch began to literally melt. The acid then immediately ate through everything, all the way down to the bone. As this happened, the chaos was even greater than before, but soon it was quiet as many of the 23 passengers who jumped literally disintegrated on that roadside. Those who didn't seek false refuge in the ditch weren't in much better shape, though. Özdemir, the 7 remaining passengers, and the truck driver all suffered injuries of varying severity, but one thing was common among all of them: the intense, unimaginable searing. And while there's no such thing as pure nitric acid, since water is needed in the production of the liquid, the concentration of the nitric acid in the tanker was so high that even a few drops on exposed skin would cause the feeling to be intense and constant. As word of the accident got out, people from the nearby village and soldiers from a nearby battalion responded and transported the injured to the closest hospital. And within moments of arriving, the hospital was consumed with both the scent and sound as doctors worked to neutralize the effect of the acid. Sometime later, and after a 6-hour battle for his life, the truck driver died at the hospital, and 7 more passengers succumbed to their wounds. Those who survived did so only to endure more. Even days after the accident, the experience was so bad that survivors would often beg hospital staff to relieve them. The only way they knew was a sure thing. Passengers would go on to lose eyes, feet, and hands, and the lucky ones who got to keep all of their appendages were still scarred for life. Of the 40 passengers and 2 drivers involved in the accident, only 9 people, including Özdemir, would survive what began as a mere fender bender. Back at the scene on the highway, there was very little left of some of the passengers who leapt into the ditch. All that remained of some were parts, and others were reduced to just a few fragments, as the only evidence that they were ever alive in the first place. In the aftermath, just 30 feet or 10 meters from where the accident took place, the villagers dug a grave and placed all the remains inside before covering them with dirt. Today, there is a large memorial tomb that lies on top of the grave to commemorate the lives that were lost on the morning of August 11th, 1965. When the accident occurred, the bus was only about 50 miles, or 80 kilometers, from its final destination. Chicago and Peshtigo were being ravaged by a meteorological phenomenon known as a fire whirl. The 2 respective fires produced so much heat that it rose skyward and mixed with the cooler air high above the cities. As this occurred, the air started to spin and swirl, not unlike a tornado would. And these fire whirls were unimaginably destructive to both communities as they sent flaming debris into the night sky before depositing it wherever the wind would take it. This then caused the fire to jump the Chicago River a second time, leading to a railroad car full of kerosene to explode as the fire raged northward. As the sun rose on that Monday morning, Chicago continued to burn. The city's North Division was decimated by the flames, and by noon, the fire had reached North Avenue and continued in excess of another mile. But just after the sun set on the still blazing city that evening, something unexpected happened. It finally started to rain. It was Chicago's first precipitation in more than 10 days, and it continued into Tuesday, October 10th. That morning, the last flames were put out as rainfall and unbuilt lots on the north side of the city came together to end the rampage. The fire in Peshtigo, meanwhile, came to a conclusion much earlier as it burned itself out in the early morning hours of October 9th. But that wasn't the result of assistance from the rain. There was simply nothing left in the city for the fire to consume. Peshtigo had burned to the ground as if it never existed in the first place. Reverend Peter and many Peshtigo residents spent more than 5 hours in the cold river in hopes of escaping the fire, only for some to die of hypothermia. The days and weeks that followed both fires slowly revealed a picture of just how destructive each was. In Chicago, it would be days before anyone could enter the smoldering parts of the city because it was still just too hot. Even as it became safer to venture into the areas that were decimated, it was so hot that businessmen hoping to retrieve valuables from their fireproof safes could only watch as their money burst into flames the moment it was exposed to outside air. The Great Chicago Fire, as it's now known, that began as a barn blaze onto DeKoven Street, wiped out an area of 6.4 kilometers, 4 miles long, and 1.2 kilometers, 0.75 miles wide. The ruins included around 17,450 buildings, 117 kilometers, 73 miles of roads, and 193 kilometers, 120 miles, of sidewalks. And no area was hit harder than the city's North Division. Of the 13,800 buildings that were located there, just 500 were left, thrusting around 75,000 citizens into homelessness. In total, 1/3 of the city's buildings were reduced to rubble, 1/3 of its residents lost their homes, and the cost of the disaster came out to 1/3 of the city's entire valuation. The death toll of the Great Chicago Fire is also the source of some debate, but it's generally accepted that around 300 people were killed during the blaze. The county coroner at the time concluded that an accurate death count would be impossible, as some people drowned in the river while others were completely incinerated. Meanwhile, the human cost of the Peshtigo fire is almost beyond belief. Of the 2,000 permanent residents, at least 1,100 died. Some estimates even place that number closer to 2,500 deaths, which accounts for the visitors in the city at the time the fire burst out in the forest. As a result, it still tops the list of the deadliest fires in recorded U.S. history. And while it was a significantly shorter event than the Great Chicago Fire, the Peshtigo Fire was no less catastrophic. In the end, about 1.2 million acres of land was scorched, and the cost of the disaster came in just below that of Chicago's. However, Reverend Peter would survive both the fire and the frigid water that night. In the aftermath, it was determined that the Peshtigo fire began as several slash-and-burn fires merged into one as a result of the severe drought conditions and the extremely strong winds on October 8th. On the other hand, how exactly the Great Chicago Fire started isn't so easy to explain. This is part of the story that's reached a sort of legendary status, as it's commonly believed that the fire was the result of one of the cows in the O'Leary barn kicking over a lantern. The truth is, though, that the fire's origin will likely never be known, as the blaze completely destroyed every piece of evidence that could have helped experts come to a conclusion. In the void of this uncertainty, many stories have been put forward. Like, for example, one account says that a group of men were gambling inside the barn when one of them carelessly knocked over a lantern. Another concludes that it was purposely set by vandals. Spontaneous combustion has also been put forth as a possibility, considering the conditions that dry and the large stores of dry straw in the barn. But unfortunately, again, the real cause will likely never be known. In the wake of the destruction, Chicago rebuilt itself quickly and efficiently with new laws that required buildings to be constructed of fireproof materials like brick and stone. Because these materials were more expensive than wood, though, many of the city's lower and middle-class residents couldn't afford to rebuild. Many couldn't even afford to be covered by fire insurance in the first place. But even those who had coverage were out of luck, as the fire destroyed many insurance companies, turning the policies stored in those buildings into ash. As a result, thousands fled the city to start new lives. But still, many more moved in. By 1880, Chicago's population had reached 500,000 people, and it was well on its way to re-establishing itself as one of the country's most economically important cities. Peshtigo, on the other hand, having been completely razed by the fire, struggled to get back on its feet, but residents and businesses alike didn't abandon the city. The woodenware factory was rebuilt, and many other companies followed that lead. It would take the better part of 10 years, but by 1881, the city had risen from its ashes. Reverend Peter's church was one of the first buildings reconstructed in the aftermath of the fire, and it still stands in the city today. Newfoundland and Labrador is one of Canada's 10 provinces, and it's located on the extreme eastern coast of North America. Within the province, the town of Pouch Cove sits almost at the easternmost point of the continent, about 17 miles north of Newfoundland's capital city of St. John's. It's so far east, in fact, that the town proclaims itself as the first to see the sun. Now, despite its proximity to St. John's, Pouch Cove has a relatively remote feel to it. Even today, only about 2,000 people call it home, but far fewer were living in the area in the late 1800s. But despite its small size, calling it picturesque would be drastically underselling the natural beauty of the oceanfront town. The coastline that Pouch Cove occupies is about as gorgeous as it gets, with tall, rocky cliffs that rise from a boulder-strewn shore. Massive waves also crash into the cove, providing much of the quaint town with a near-constant sound of the roaring sea. Initially a British territory until 1949, Newfoundland was and still is significant to seafaring industries. Because of this, it was naturally an ideal place for shipbuilding, and in 1869 the Brits completed a schooner that was dubbed the Water Witch. Compared to other ships of the time, there was nothing really different or special about the vessel in its single-deck, double-mast configuration. The Water Witch was 69 feet or 21 meters long and about 19 feet or 6 meters at its widest, so it wasn't built to be the biggest or fastest ship of the period. It also wasn't constructed to cross oceans. Instead, it was intended to be a vessel that hugged the coastline and transported cargo and people relatively short distances, which was a purpose that it served well. In the early evening of November 29, 1875, the Water Witch left St. John's with 25 people aboard, including 50-year-old Captain Samuel Spracklin. The rest of the ship's occupants were either members of the crew or men and women carrying provisions back home for the winter. The ship was bound for the tiny town of Cupids on Conception Bay, which was its home port. This routine 40-mile trip would take the ship north from St. John's, then around Cape St. Francis on the northeast side of the Avalon Peninsula, then southwest into Cupids. When the Water Witch departed St. John's, the weather was similar to what Pouch Cove was experiencing early in the evening, which were strong winds and snowfall. These weren't optimal sailing conditions, but they weren't impossible either, at least not until later that night. As the weather gained in intensity, though, visibility diminished to almost nothing, and the captain and crew of the Water Witch were left navigating the ship based on nothing more than the sounds of the waves, travel time, and the sense of the sea they'd developed over years of sailing. As evening turned to night, the captain used those factors to pinpoint on his map where the ship most likely was. When he marked their probable location, he saw that they were clear of Cape St. Francis and the ship could begin its turn west, which he ordered. This was a decision that would be met with disastrous consequences. Around 9:30 p.m., the lookout in the crow's nest shouted a frantic warning about there being rocks straight ahead, but Samuel thought that couldn't be possible. He then looked toward the bow of the ship, and while there was still a bit of distance between the Water Witch and the rocky coast, he immediately knew it was too late to do anything about it. As it turned out, they weren't in fact clear of Cape St. Francis. The strong southwesterly wind had slowed the Water Witch's northern progress, so instead, the Water Witch was headed directly into an area known as Horrid Gulch. This ominous name is fitting too. Horrid Gulch is little more than a narrow slit in the coastline, where cliffs hundreds of feet tall concentrate the power of the waves between their walls before they crash into the gulch's furthest inland wall. There's no true sense of shore in the gulch either, because the water is very deep right up to the edge of the coastline. So for example, if you stand at sea level and drop a stone into the water, the stone will fall a great distance before hitting the bottom, because there is no gradual slope or shallow shore. Instead, the waves have carved out a deep, turbulent area beneath the surface, making the water depth significant, even near the shore. This churning action of the waves also prevents anything that falls into the water from easily escaping. Standing at the bow, it was clear to Samuel that the impact with the far rock wall was going to be worse than any boat collision he'd ever experienced before. As the Water Witch rapidly approached the cliff face, Samuel, his son, and two other crewmen positioned themselves on the bow's rail. A moment later, they leapt for the boulders that jutted out of the gulch's waters, making it just before the water witch slammed into the wall, which immediately destroyed much of the bow. In fact, it hit so hard that the ship rebounded backwards some distance, and after seeing their captain and fellow crewmen make their desperate leap for the rocks, 9 other crew members jumped before the second impact and managed to avoid being smashed in the collision. This second collision was so violent and so damaging to the ship that just seconds later, the water witch slipped under the waters. It then sank to the deep bottom of the gulch with 8 remaining men and 4 women still aboard. With the ship resting at the bottom of the ocean, 13 survivors clung to the rocks around Horrid Gulch. Samuel and those who jumped with him ended up on one side, while 9 others who leapt before the second impact were in a much more dangerous position across the gulch. They barely had enough room for each of them to stand on the wet, sloping ledge that sat just a few feet above the churning water below, and horrifyingly above them was a sheer cliff face, 600 feet or 183 meters high. Samuel and the others, meanwhile, were in a bit of a better spot. Behind them was a hill with a steep grade of about 40 degrees in the form of a trench that ran the same 600 feet to the very top. If they were going to survive, the captain and those with him would have to pull their way up the long, steep, slippery slope that was covered in overgrowth and brush, and then try to find help in an area where they had no idea where they were. And if that wasn't enough of a challenge, they'd have to do this on a pitch-black night in blinding snow and winds, while soaking wet in freezing temperatures and without any ropes or anything else. This was a next to impossible task, but they didn't have much of a choice either. They could either stay on the rocks and get battered by the waves and either drown or succumb to hypothermia, or they could die trying to save themselves. So, Samuel, his son, and the 2 crewmen latched onto the rocks of the trench and started their dangerous climb after shouting to the others that they were going to get help. By some miracle, some time later, they all reached the top and were exhausted and in disbelief that they were still alive. They then took a moment to catch their breath and check each other over to make sure that they were each okay. And incredibly, somehow, they defied the odds without suffering more than a few scratches and bruises. Once that was over with, they had to confront the next problem. As they looked around in the limited visibility they had to work with, there was nothing at the top of the cliff. No houses, no roads, and no signs of civilization. All they could really do was choose a random direction, and the wrong choice could lead them nowhere, which would be a death sentence for the men they left behind, and probably for themselves, too. Then suddenly they heard the faint sound of a dog barking to the south, and that was enough to help them make the decision on which way to go. Still soaked to the bone and with the freezing wind at their backs, they trudged through the snow with nothing more than a few dog barks to guide them. Because the visibility was so poor, the men could be walking by houses occupied by people and never know it. So in hopes that someone would hear them, they shouted as they walked. Around 1:30 a.m., one of them spotted a light through the snow, and as they drew closer to it, a small cottage came into view. In it, a man named William Langmead was sleeping soundly until some strange sounds began to wake him up. As he sat completely still in bed and listened closely, he could swear he heard voices. They were distant and barely perceptible, to the point where William questioned whether or not his mind was playing tricks on him. However, the voices grew louder, and it became clear that it was neither his imagination nor the wind. In fact, it sounded like 4 separate voices, each of them desperately screaming for help. William then hastily rushed to the front door to see what all the shouting was about. When he threw the door open, he never expected that he'd find himself in the middle of one of the most harrowing disasters in Newfoundland history. Just the sight of Samuel and the others was enough to communicate to William that these men had been through some kind of horrible ordeal. This was then confirmed to him as Samuel explained the predicament through a shaky, shivering voice. William then hurried them inside the house to warm them up, and the 4 men huddled near the fire. William then grabbed some brandy, believing it would warm them, and once he was certain they were settled, he told them he was going to go round up some help. Throwing on a coat and hat, he entered the storm and went door to door, gathering as many able-bodied Pouch Cove men as he could. By 3 o'clock that morning, half the town was awake as citizens sprang into action upon hearing the news of the shipwreck and the trapped survivors. Many of them grabbed any equipment that could come in handy during the rescue before running out of their houses and gathering near William's house. Finally, armed with lanterns, ropes, and brandy, the team began to walk to the north. Because Samuel and the 3 other men were in such bad shape, they remained in William's home, leaving the rescuers only vague directions that could lead them to the location of the shipwreck. By their description, however, locals could tell they were referring to Horrid Gulch, and as they neared the cliffs that overlooked the area, the screams and cries of the men below could be heard. When the survivors heard the rescuers shout in return, they begged for a rope or anything else that could get them off the precipice. This response then allowed the rescuers to pinpoint their locations, since the dark night and snow obscured any view of them. However, even with ropes and lanterns, the rescue attempt would be far more dangerous than the climb Samuel and the other crewmen undertook. Reaching the survivors meant somehow descending 600 feet of near vertical cliff face. As the volunteers huddled to formulate a plan, there was only one conclusion any of them could come to. Someone would have to be brave enough to dangle from the end of a rope all the way down to the ledge where the survivors clung to life. The men then looked at one another, and with little hesitation, a fisherman named Alfred Moores stepped forward and tied the end of a thick rope around his waist before walking to the edge of the cliff. The other end of the rope was affixed to a nearby tree, and between the tree and Alfred, each of the remaining volunteers grabbed a hold of the rope, putting every bit of manpower into lowering him safely. Alfred then stepped back tentatively over the edge, but as soon as he let go of the cliff, the wind swung the rope and almost immediately put him into an out-of-control spin. There would end up being 3 different attempts to lower him, and all 3 ended with Alfred needing to be pulled back up to the top of the cliff. Finally, on the 4th try, he was able to maintain just enough control to reach the end of the rope's slack, which put him on a ledge of his own. The problem was that he was still 30 feet or 9 meters above the 9 shipwreck survivors. By then, the morning sun was also starting to rise, and Alfred could finally lay eyes on them, and he could hardly believe the precariousness of the ledges they were on, or his own for that matter. Still, he had no choice but to try to rescue them. Alfred then dropped a hand rope down to the men, and using that rope as a guide, he dropped the end of a stronger rope that would be used for pulling each of them up. Once that reached them, the first man tied it around his waist. As this was happening, some of the volunteers used the rope that Alfred was attached to as a guide to strategically position themselves on multiple ledges of the cliff at varying heights. Most of the men remained at the top to better concentrate their strength on more solid ground, while those in the ledges would help pull survivors up, as well as relay communication between the men at the top and Alfred at the bottom. Once the rope was secured around the first survivor and he was ready, Alfred signaled to the men above, and they started to pull. It felt like it took forever, but hand over hand, the rescuers pulled until the first man was safely at the top of the cliff. Almost immediately, he was met with a shot of brandy before being guided to Pouch Cove, where he could be attended to by those who remained behind. This was a process that took hours and cost the volunteers every single bit of energy they had, but 7 more survivors were saved as the same manner as the first. That left just 1 more. A frightened and soaked boy who was on a separate ledge. It was clear that he would die if he wasn't saved as quickly as possible, but his position put his rescue in doubt. The volunteers wondered if they could even get Alfred to him, but they at least had to try. They then repositioned Alfred, and he flung the end of a rope in the boy's direction. The boy managed to catch it, and using what little energy he had left, he tied it around his waist. When he was finally lifted off the rocky ledge, he had been stuck there, clinging to life for 10.5 hours. He was so exhausted that some of the men had to carry him all the way back to Pouch Cove, where each house in the entire town had opened its doors to these shipwrecked men. As the storm settled and the survivors were cared for back in Pouch Cove, more volunteers set about retrieving the bodies of those who perished when the water witch impacted the rocks of Horrid Gulch. Tragically, 6 of the 12 who died were members of Samuel's family. In Pouch Cove, coffins awaited the dead as each body was carefully and reverently placed inside before being shipped back to loved ones for proper burial. Most of those they pulled from the wreck were in surprisingly good shape, but one of the younger men was found with his legs completely gone, demonstrating just how forcefully the ship hit the rocks of Horrid Gulch. In the aftermath, Alfred's selfless actions that day earned him the nickname Brave Alfred Moores, which stuck with him for the rest of his life. His fearlessness also earned him a silver medal from the British Royal Humane Society. The 5 other men who went part of the way down the cliff to assist each received bronze medals as well, and all of the survivors of the shipwreck made full recoveries. Pennsylvania's Wyoming Valley was once a powerhouse of energy production for the United States. Thanks to the area's massive deposit of anthracite, which is a type of coal up to 6 times more valuable than regular coal, the Wyoming Valley played a significant role during the American Industrial Revolution. And due to this and other factors, it saw a wealth of success during World War II's. The employment rate skyrocketed with the need for coal increasing. But unfortunately, this boom wouldn't last indefinitely as alternative fuel sources started to enter the marketplace. By the time World War II began in 1939, the demand for anthracite wasn't nearly what it once was, and while most blue-collar industries raked in money as they supported the American war effort, the Wyoming Valley was very much in decline, and obviously things didn't get any better after the war ended, as unemployment rates for the region were some of the highest anywhere in the nation. The industry held on as best as it could, and many mines in the area were still operational by the late 1950s. However, conditions and ethics were sketchy at best, as the companies that owned the mines pushed to produce as much anthracite as possible. This was an approach that would lead to disaster at the Knox Mine in Pittston on January 22, 1959. That morning, around 81 miners living in a 3-county Wyoming valley got up and got ready for work. 41-year-old Frank Orlowski, who worked in the mines much of his adult life, began his morning routine, which usually consisted of enjoying a cup of coffee while reading the newspaper before heading out. He never usually ate breakfast, but that morning he said he was hungry, so his wife made him a bowl of cereal before she packed a few extra sandwiches in his lunch pail. Elsewhere, Samuel Altieri always rode the bus with his wife together in the mornings, as the stops for their respective jobs were along the same route. After saying goodbye to his wife, she got off the bus to begin her work shift at the Pittston Apparel Company, and the two went their separate ways. When surveyor Joseph Stella got to work, he entered the Knox mine with plans to inspect some of the work sites. It had been a week or two since he performed a routine inspection on some of the mine's miles of underground tunnels, so he entered the main shaft of the river slope section and began heading toward where several crews were working. He then reached one of the work sites and checked that everything was as it should be, before turning around in the direction of another work site. Just as he was making his way down another one of the mine's many corridors, he heard one of the miners from behind shouting to get out of the mine. When John turned around, he then saw Samuel and several of the other miners running behind him. He and some other miners then rounded up the rest of the men and started making their way toward the main shaft, and before long, they noticed something under their feet. It was water, and it was rising fast. Now, the Knox mine was an elaborate maze of tunnels that was as deep as 1,000 feet, or 305 meters beneath the surface. But part of the mine, particularly the river slope section, ran directly under the Susquehanna River, so the mine operators always had to be mindful not to dig too close to the riverbed. On that day, though, one of the crews neglected to drill boreholes to gauge how thick the rock ceiling was. At the very minimum, 35 feet or 11 meters was considered safe to dig to, but something had gone very wrong. Digging in the section went much too close to the riverbed, and the roof collapsed, causing millions of gallons of water to come rushing into the mine in an instant. It just so happened also that the Susquehanna River was experiencing one of the worst floods in recent memory at the time due to heavy rains earlier in the week. As water gushed into the mine, the surface of the river just above the 75-foot or 23-meter-wide hole began swirling, and a violent whirlpool formed, sucking down flood debris and huge chunks of ice that had formed in the river. So before long, their run toward the main shaft turned into a trudge through waist-deep water that was rapidly rising. As the torrent continued to flood the tunnels, 7 of the men spent the next 5 hours in frigid river water, only escaping after climbing hundreds of feet up an air shaft they discovered further upstream. Elsewhere, 7 hours after the water began pouring into the mine, another group of 26 survivors was found wading through the flooded tunnels and led to safety. As more and more of those who managed to escape gathered outside the mine, it became apparent that 12 miners were missing, and if they survived at all, they were likely trapped. Around this time as well, at least 28 men were taken to local hospitals with various injuries. At 3:15 that afternoon, and as all hell was breaking loose at the mine, Samuel's wife waited on the corner outside her workplace as the bus pulled up. Normally, she'd board the bus and be greeted by her husband's face smiling back at her from their usual seats. But this time, Samuel wasn't there. Initially, she didn't pay it much mind because he would sometimes get a ride home from work from one of his fellow miners, but she quickly learned that something was terribly wrong when a woman on the bus turned to her and asked her if she heard about the accident at the Knox mine. As terrifying as this news was to hear, she knew that because Samuel was an electrician, he wasn't always required to be in the mine, so she'd hoped she'd find him already home when she arrived. When that wasn't the case, and the hours ticked by without any sign of him, she made her way to the mine only to be met with a large crowd of gathering townspeople. In the crowd, she found several other miners, clearly soaking wet and exhausted from what they'd endured to escape, and they assured her that Samuel got out because they saw him. He had apparently posted up in one of the tunnels and was helping point the passing men towards safety and doing his best to keep everyone calm. While she was still trying to process everything that was going on, a frantic effort to stop the flood was underway. In order to do that, the hole would have to be plugged up, but there was no way to access it from inside the flooding mine. The only way to stop the water was to plug the hole from the river itself. Officials needed to use the whirlpool to their advantage, since it was pulling the entire river toward it. Soon enough, they started dumping mine cars, railroad cars, bales of hay, and piles of scrap wood into the swirling waters, hoping that by piling up this type of debris, it would plug the hole. So by nightfall, more than 30 coal gondolas and hundreds of bales of hay had been tossed into the whirlpool, but incredibly, its strength wasn't letting up. This effort continued throughout the night and into the next day, and since the Knox mine had connection points to the other mines in the Wyoming Valley, 11 operations were suddenly closed for the foreseeable future, putting about 10,000 miners out of work. Afterward, those who could assisted in the effort to plug the gaping hole in the riverbed, and by midday, the Lehigh Valley Railroad began building a road alongside its tracks to give trucks better access to the whirlpool, which sat about 20 yards from the swollen riverbank. Then, by the end of the day, 38 more gondola cars, 200 mine cars, and truckloads of the largest rocks that could be gathered were dumped into the river, as well as utility poles, railroad ties, and any other bulky debris rescuers could find. During a press briefing around this time, mine officials reported they believed that they had slowed the flow of water into the mine by about 30 to 35%. They also expressed hope that the 12 men that were missing had found higher ground. But as time went on, a tragic picture started to come together. A miner who refused to be named in newspaper articles told reporters that he had personally witnessed 3 bodies swirling in the floodwaters inside the mine's tunnels. And even more ominously, water measurements were taken at different shafts in the area. At the number 14 coal company shaft, about a mile south of the Knox mine, the water had reached a depth of 325 feet, or 99 meters. And at the closer Hoyt shaft, the water had risen to 500 feet, or 152 meters. This did not bode well for the survival conditions of the missing miners. If the water was that high at the connecting mines, it was a strong indication that the Knox mine was almost completely flooded out by that point. On January 25th, a scathing report appeared in a local newspaper about how the wives of the missing miners had been treated by the mining company. Not only had the women not slept in 2 nights since the flood occurred, but they were also furious. All of them had gathered together, and the company officials knew where the women were holding vigil, yet no one from the company met with them or even told them that their husbands were among the missing. The names of the 12 missing miners were printed in newspapers and released to radio stations, and until that point, the only way they could have known that their loved ones were possibly victims of the flood was through them not showing up at home. One of the wives of the missing even said that they lived about a 10-minute walk from the mine, and her husband always followed the same routine after work. He'd come home, have a beer, and then take a bath. When she came home from her workday, she discovered the house empty and the beer in the refrigerator untouched. It wasn't until she learned of the flood by word of mouth that she connected the dots. Later that day, another press briefing was held, and the Knox Mining Company officials had several big updates to share. After 3 days of pouring anything they could into the river to stop the flood, they had finally managed to plug the hole. With that said, though, they had very little hope that any of the men who were missing could still be alive inside. The mine superintendent even went as far as to tell the media that there were no high points that were above the waterline inside, and once again, this was also news that the loved ones of the missing men had to learn through reporters. Around noon on January 26th, pumps that had arrived at site were set to be switched on, but there was an unexpected delay. Word of the disaster had caused many people from nearby towns and even out of state to flock to the Wyoming Valley. With the number of cars far exceeding the number of parking spots, people simply began abandoning their cars in the middle of city streets, which impeded efforts to get pumping underway. It would end up taking more than 100 police officers to sort out the mess and clear the way for Army engineers and Navy consultants to reach the scene and begin the pumping effort. And obviously, time was of the essence, as the missing men, if alive, had been trapped for 4 days. Unfortunately, though, this would prove to be an insignificant delay. Pumping took place around the clock for 4 more days, and the water level inside the mine only dropped about 4 or 5 feet, or less than 2 meters. On January 29th, pumps with the ability to remove up to 133,000 gallons of water a minute arrived at the mine, but there was more bad news. Estimates of how much river water had spilled into the mine were up to 40 billion gallons. The Pennsylvania State Secretary of Mines even said that it would likely take upwards of 3 weeks or more to reach the miners. In fact, he believed that it would take another week or 2 just to reduce the water level by 100 feet. And so, hope that the missing men would be found alive was all but crushed by the news. Pumping continued despite the tragic developments, but on February 10th, the effort suffered a setback as water started leaking back into the mine from the Susquehanna. By then, any reports in the mine had presumed that all the missing men were dead. Despite the efforts to pump the mine free of water, the bodies of the 12 men were never found. Frank and Samuel were among the dead. An inquiry into the disaster got underway, and it was determined that the flood occurred as a result of illegal mining practices by the Knox Mining Company. Workers were advised to dig closer to the riverbed than was safe, which ultimately caused the ceiling to fail and billions of gallons of water to begin pouring in. 10 mine officials would go on to be indicted, and 6 of them would serve jail time for their roles in the disaster. Sadly, the poor treatment of the widows would continue, as the wives of the 12 victims wouldn't receive death benefits for more than 4 years after the tragedy. Some mining still occurs in the Wyoming Valley today, but the effects of the Knox mine disaster are still felt, as residents are reluctant to support new energy industries in the area.